Breakdancing competitions are a test of strength, willpower, and sheer endurance. The first official contest, Battle of the Year, was founded in 1990 by Thomas Hergenrother in Germany, and it is still to this day the largest international breakdancing competition for breakdance crews. Now, this is all very common knowledge to you, I understand that. But maybe what isn't so common knowledge is the way that the scoring works. It's not just as simple as, wow, he's just under Flibbington, or that lethargy was very pudding. No, it goes a lot deeper. But to truly understand how these scores are constructed, we need to go back. We need to go way back. We need to discuss the blossoming friendship between France and Israel. We need to discuss the French connection. The State of Israel was birthed on the 14th of May 1948, and for the first 5 years of its life had no major allies. By no major allies, I mean no one was willing to supply it with endless arms to allow the continuation of fighting with neighbouring Arab states, as well as displacing native Palestinians. It's odd because you would have thought from the get-go that the West would have been more than happy in giving the newly founded country a head start. But no, at the time, no major superpowers were allowed to supply any Middle Eastern country with weapons. Sort of. You see, just before the Arab-Israeli War started on May 15, 1948, a weapons embargo was placed on Middle Eastern countries. The refusal to sell weapons to the region was an attempt to let no country get the upper hand in terms of military force, allowing Israel time to establish itself without fear of attack. This, bolstered with the Tripartite Declaration, which was a joint statement by the US, UK and France to guarantee the territorial status quo that had been determined by the outcome of the 1949 Arab-Israeli armistice agreements, would supposedly bring peace to the area. However, this didn't affect pre-existing arrangements between nations, such as the UK and Jordan, with the UK continuing to supply weapons to Jordan. This was not in Israel's favour at all. It was being denied access to arms it so desperately needed, whilst its neighbours continued to benefit from pre-existing deals. The Arab capitals were calling for a second round of fighting. Things were beginning to heat up again. Israel needed to legitimise itself further by increasing its defensive capabilities. It needed to find a way round the embargo. Enter Shimon Peres. Peres throughout his life had many roles. He was head of Israel's Navy at age 24, appointed Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Defence from the years 1953 to 1965, and was even briefly Prime Minister following the 1995 assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. One of his lesser talked about roles, though, was lobbying for Israel. Now, lobbying can take many forms, but in general, lobbyists communicate the views of special interest groups to lawmakers, including members of Congress. They aim to influence how lawmakers write or vote on legislation. During a time when Israel had no major allies and had caused several conflicts, it was important for a figure like Peres to step up and find unorthodox ways of gaining support for his state. In the years leading up to 1954, Israel had repeatedly tried to procure an arms deal with the US, with basically no success. A lot of that owing to Israeli raids into West Bank villages in Gaza, leading to the deaths of civilians, causing widespread international condemnation. Luckily, there's no way they'd do that in this day and age, so I guess we can all be glad of that. With no hopes of weapons from the US, Peres, therefore, sought an alternative and unexpected ally: France. On the surface, the two didn't have much in common, and a lot of the Israeli cabinet, including the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, actually didn't really back France. In fact, Ben-Gurion was quoted saying to Peres, "Why did they surrender to the Nazis?" Looking a bit deeper though, we can see that there were actually multiple reasons for the two nations to form an alliance.
Number 1. Losing imperial clouds.
France lost influence in Syria after the al-Shashekli regime fell in February 1954, a blow to its status as an imperial power.
Number 2. The Baghdad Pact.
This was a mutual defence treaty initiated by the US and NATO, signed by Great Britain, Turkey, Pakistan, Iran and Iraq, aimed at keeping the Soviet Union at bay. Now, who wasn't invited to the party? France. Furthermore, this was a conflict of interest for Israel because now the Middle East were gaining arms again, upsetting the balance within the region.
Number 3. Romans in North Africa.
Arguably, the most important reason was France's problem with Egypt and Algeria. Well, there we go. I did it. I mentioned Algeria. Go on. Enjoy, mates. Enjoy. More on Algeria later, though. First, we need to talk about the Suez Canal, Egypt, and Gamal Abdel Nasser. The Suez Canal was opened in 1869. This was a 100-mile waterway that cut straight through the Egyptian desert and saved 5,000 miles off of voyages from Europe to Asia. The construction took 10 years, was overseen by French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps, and cost the lives of thousands of Egyptians. 120,000 Egyptians to be exact. So who benefited from the profits of the Suez Canal? Why, its shareholders, of course, who included France, Austria, Russia and Egypt. Surely the leader of Egypt at the time had his people in mind and put the profits to good use, using them for infrastructure or reparations to the families of those Egyptians who died. There's no way he'd sell his shares to the British, right? In 1882, Egypt became a British protectorate for the next 60 years. Even though it formally gained its independence in 1922, it was basically still under British rule, and all subsequent leaders were British puppets, including King Farouk, until 1952. The people of Egypt were becoming increasingly frustrated with current events. Farouk failing to prevent the State of Israel to exist, the loss of the Arab-Israeli War, and the overall remaining of British presence in a country that supposedly shed its colonial ties decades prior. What happened was a military coup against the king, in which he abdicated the throne and went to live on a peaceful life in Italy. Oh, nice. Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser emerged as Egypt's new leader. Now, I don't know loads about Nasser, I'll be the first to admit that. But what I do know is that he didn't enjoy Israel coming into Egyptian territory and killing civilians. He sought to increase Egypt's military capabilities. But, like I said before though, there's an arms embargo on the Middle East. I know Egypt is North Africa, believe me, I know, but the West lump them all together, don't they? Ugh. And so the US refused to give any. You know who didn't have an embargo though? The Soviets, who immediately supplied them with all that metal. In an incredibly large move by Nasser on July 26, 1956, he nationalised the Suez Canal Company. Quote, "We dug the canal with our lives, our skulls, our bones, our blood. The money is ours, and the Suez Canal belongs to us." Before moving on, I would like to emphasise that Nasser's move was entirely legal. This wasn't him prompting for a war to start. The shareholders would be bought out, and Egypt, whose people died in the hundreds of thousands to build a canal for which they were exploited for decades, would belong to Egypt. Of course, the West didn't really like that. Sir Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister between the years 1955 to 1957, saw Nasser's nationalisation as an attack on Britain and Europe as a whole. This was because, of course, they couldn't let Egypt own the canal, in which thousands of ships brought oil from the Middle East through. Eden called Nasser an Arab dictator that Britain had to face down. Shimon, the French Prime Minister at the time, agreed with this sentiment. His reasoning was a bit different though. Nasser promoted pan-Arabism, and within this, self-determination for countries under colonial rule, and especially those in North Africa, such as Algeria. Algeria had been under France's brutal colonial regime since 1830, and was now fighting back in its War of Independence, which lasted 8 years, from November 1st, 1954 to the 19th of March, 1962. Nasser was more than just vocal in his support for Algeria. Egypt trained and housed FLN members, providing significant military aid. France, of course, couldn't have two North African countries linking up, and so joined Britain's plight in eliminating Nasser. Okay, so you've got Britain and France ready to attack Egypt. They've got the backing of 20 out of 22 nations invited to the London Conference on August 16th, 1956. Interestingly though, you also have the Eisenhower administration urging them not to take military action. Not because of the potential loss of life, of course, but because of fears of further Egypt-Soviet relations. So, who attacks first then? Britain or France? Israel, actually. As mentioned before, the Yanks specifically told the Brits and French not to attack Egypt, so they couldn't just invade outright. No, they had to be a bit sneakier. So, they did what any good Western country does, and planned a secret war with the help of Israel, all linking up in France to discuss. Let's go through the plan. Israel invades Egypt, claiming self-defence. Britain and France issue a ceasefire ultimatum for Egypt and Israel, knowing only Israel would accept. Britain and France then directly intervene in Egypt, overthrowing Nasser for the sake of peace and democracy. These lot are legit tapped, innit? October 29th, you've got Israeli paratroopers landing on the Egyptian Sinai and basically laying the groundwork for further invasion via the peninsula. Now, what was Israel's excuse for this invasion? Self-defence, of course. The state claimed that it was defending itself against Palestinian national forces known as Fedayeen, who apparently had bases in both Gaza and Sinai. In reality, Ben-Gurion had been looking for an excuse to invade Egypt for months. He wanted the Straits of Tiran, which would give Israel access to the Red Sea and would provide crucial trade connections. Israel saw an opportunity to get in on something good here. Also, it was later found that there were no Palestinian forces in either of the places Israel claimed. They've legit straight up been lying since their inception. Anyway, this all went according to plan. Except that the US and Soviets teamed up at the UN and forced a ceasefire. The US in particular were bare angry at Britain for going against their direct orders. It really showed that at this point in history, the old colonial powers, they didn't really matter anymore, and that the big dogs were now the Soviets and the US. The Brits left Egypt, followed by the French. Israel, however, gained access to the Straits of Tiran, which was a win for them, but they of course still felt threatened by Egypt. This entire conflict led to Israel and France becoming close allies over the next decade. You had Arab nationalism rising, which was, in both France and Israel's best interest to suppress. You had France feeling snaked out by the US and Britain. On top of this, you had Perez making, use of the many pro-Zionist members of the socialist French cabinet, leading to, eventually, not only arms being supplied to Israel by France as of 1956, but also the development of Israel's nuclear program. Yep, France were the ones to start Israel's nuclear program way back in the 50s. Kinda mad to think about that one. So, at the height of France and Israel's alliance, you had the Algerian War for Independence happening. How did the two benefit each other during this time then, I hear you ask? Well, for a start, France supplied constant arms to Israel, and in return, Israeli intelligence, Mossad, would galvanise the Jewish community in Constantine to give France the information they needed on various operations occurring within the country. Mossad also armed the Jewish community, which led to violent clashes in what is known as the Constantine Massacre. This massacre, according to the testimony of former Mossad agent Abraham Bezalai, happened due to some members of the Jewish community being instructed to bomb a Jewish cafe in Constantine and pin the blame on Muslims. Confusion and bloodshed followed. Now, I want to point out that there has always been a Jewish community within Algeria, and this goes all the way back to the Roman era, so we're talking about, quite a long time. In the 1770s, you had the House of Bakri in Constantine, a famous and successful merchant house run by the Bakri brothers, who were Jewish. This is the same House of Bakri that sold grains to the French, who in turn never paid their debt, and this actually led to Algeria becoming a French colony. Anyway, the Jewish community has always existed in the region and peacefully coexisted with both the Berber and Arab populations. The French also dehumanised the Algerian Jewish population as they did with the Muslim population, leading to such quotes as "Algerian Jews were simply incompatible with Western civilization," as prominent right-wing French nationalist Charles de Bouzet said. Due to Israel's problematic nature and it ethnically cleansing the state of Palestine, it heightened tensions in Algeria between the Muslim and Jewish populations. The colonial powers then capitalised on this and used it for their own benefit. The only people suffering? The citizens of Algeria. In that same interview with Abraham Zalai, he admitted that at age 29 he was sent by the Israeli Secret Services, in the company of his wife, to set up operational cells to wage war against the ALN under the cover of a Hebrew teacher. So you have former Israeli intelligence literally admitting to arming communities within not only Constantine, but also Egypt. But Zali goes on later to admit that he and his manager, Shlomo Havilio, previously set up similar cells to destabilise Nasser's government by arming the Jewish community in Egypt in a similar manner. What's also interesting to note is that Ben Gurion met with French Prime Minister de Gaulle and discussed the two-state solution in Algeria. The partition of the country would allow the French to keep the coastal region. This of course would have been catastrophic and would have resulted in the distribution of food and other vital resources being controlled by the very same people killing Algerian citizens on their own soil. But of course, Israel would see no problem in this, would they?